Good morning, everyone. I welcome you for the part 2 of the 3-day in-house lecture series given by Dr. Tilak Agarwala. So please carry on with your fantastic presentation.
All right, thank you so much. Since you all voted to, or most of you voted to go more into technology, I thought I would give you a little bit of sense today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what is known as the technology S-curve. And these technologies, the life cycle is usually typically like this: invention, then it starts sort of emerging, it becomes a little visible, then it goes into a period of maturity, and finally saturation. This is about adoption in the marketplace. And various technologies over time have had different rates of technology maturity and then adoption, and when they flatten out. So if you look at something like electricity, started back here in 1900s, it went like that, and it took like 50 years before it got mass adoption. If you look at the telephone, telephone is not here. Yeah, telephone is here. So you look at the telephone, it took almost, it took a very long time to actually mature and get into the saturation phase. Now, if you look at what's happening today, though, cell phones and internet are two examples, and so are computers in general, where this S-curve in the maturity stage is very, very steep. We could talk about some examples of this, but I basically want to leave you with a few messages on this technology curve. So first of all, at least in the US, people are adopting these technologies at a phenomenal rate. And that's why they are actually having a disruptive impact. You know, I've been in this technology business for over 40 years, and I have never seen such steep S-curves as we are witnessing today. And not only that, but the combination of multiple exponentials is really what's going on today. However, I would like to also put a word of caution here, which is it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen with a technology that's on a very, very steep maturity curve. You really don't know what is going to happen in the future. Of course, for businesses, not necessarily for researchers, but for businesses, success or failure depends on being able to predict this accurately. But the caution that I want to leave you with is be very careful about emerging technology claims, even from me, right? You have to apply your own sort of critical thinking, and you're all intelligent people. You have to examine it critically to see whether there's reality behind the hype or whether it's just hype. So just that little bit I wanted to tell you to position. And this is true of the steep S-curve is true of the technologies we talked about yesterday, typically, let's say, machine learning. Now, let's jump into Internet of Things. So what is this Internet of Things phenomena? How many of you have heard of Internet of Things? Ah, very good. Almost all. So we'll talk in a moment about what the driving technologies are behind this, but essentially it is the fact that technology has become so cheap and so powerful that you can embed computing almost everywhere, which is what is happening today. So physical devices like vehicles, buildings, cars, refrigerators, what have you, are embedded with, are starting to get embedded with all of these electronics and software and sensors. Now, those by itself is not enough. What makes it the Internet of Things and what makes it really interesting is the fact that these devices can all be connected via the Internet, and they can exchange data, they can talk to each other. So there are 2 points here. One is computing can happen at various different places, and therefore intelligence can be put in various different places, and this is all connected. So you get this sort of another exponential because of the interconnectivity. And here's just one example to sort of make it clear. Interestingly now, IoT is being deployed across the board. I actually went and looked at what's happening with IoT in India, and especially in the energy sector, there's a lot of interest in grid technologies, which is an example of IoT. But generally, the adoption rates, as I was saying yesterday, are lower than what they are in other countries for good reasons. So in almost every industry, whether it's automotive, transportation, smart homes, energy, utilities, security, surveillance, this is happening everywhere. And the thing that I find particularly attractive, which I think you will too, is this is not just about increasing capacity. It's about improving well-being. And at least I feel that we have to constantly apply this criteria. Is it actually improving well-being or not? And how do you measure that? But the evidence is that it can improve well-being. So just to take a few examples, agriculture, right? This is a big example of IoT, precision farming, where you actually gather all kinds of information about the soil, about the climate, about the crop, and you make real-time decisions. I think some small aspects of this are being implemented in India. Is anyone aware of that? No.
Using lots of drones, etc. slowly.
Okay.
The last one that you're talking about.
You're right. Okay.
It's happening, but in a small way.
Okay.
And also some amount of IoT is being used in homes.
Okay. Okay. Good. So it will slowly catch on, but I think it's particularly relevant, I think, for India. So drones are being used to do aerial surveillance of what does the crop look like, does it have problems, is it growing properly, and so on. I find this one very interesting, the endangered species example. And in this example, this is from South Africa. As you may know, poaching is a big deal in Africa. Here, the picture, I don't know if you can see it back there, but this rhinoceros is actually missing a horn. The other one is okay. And initially, they were just doing sort of surveillance, you know, having cameras, looking at offline, looking at those pictures and trying to get to the poachers as quickly as they could. Subsequently, what they've done is they've installed infrared cameras, vehicle tracking sensors, Wi-Fi hotspots. So they've made it into an internet thing. And guards, and all of this is happening in real time. Guards are dispatched to the exact GPS location. And the arrival time has been reduced from 30 minutes to 7 minutes. And this is particularly interesting. South Africa was losing 1 rhino every week. And in 2015, I don't have statistics after that, in 2015 they lost 0 rhinos. So this IoT concept is really important. This is a very, very busy chart. I'm just throwing it up there to say that everyone talks about smarter cities, including India, and smarter cities is really about sustainability, it's about efficiency, it's about security, and it's about people. But almost everything is becoming smart, right? Fire and smoke detection, facial recognition, behavior analytics, smart toilets even. In England, they actually have these smart toilets which tell people when they require maintenance automatically. There are many examples. Traffic monitoring is another one. Some that you may or may not have heard of, a little bit more consumer-centric. They're connected contact lenses. Anyone heard about these? Okay, so these lenses, this is from Google, I believe. These lenses are also smart, and what they're able to do is they're able to measure sort of the fluid in the eye. They're also able to measure how the lens is focusing. And for people suffering from diseases, this medicine, this information about what the characteristics of the fluid are can be transmitted to doctors, and doctors can then see. You can detect diabetes, for example, using this technology, and the doctors can monitor in real time. On the focusing side, you can the lens can, I believe, can actually self-correct its focus a little bit, depending on what's happening in the eye. Activity trackers you are all aware of, but the interesting thing that's happening now is, I think it's Sloan Memorial Hospital is actually doing a very detailed study of how you can use these trackers to track the health, the physiology of the patient, whether they're feeling sick, whether they're nauseous, what's their heartbeat, and so on. A whole range of different characteristics, and this is being applied to oncology to try to determine how the patient is responding to treatment and then to correct the treatment. Smart locks. One example that I find very interesting is manufacturing. How many have heard of the concept of a digital twin? Okay. So this digital twin concept is interesting. It goes back to what we talked about yesterday in terms of modeling and simulation. And the notion here is if you can create a replica, a very good virtual replica of whatever it is, a device or even a system, and you can keep it in a safe, secure place, then you can do all kinds of analysis on that replica. First of all, producing the replica also requires a lot of modeling and simulation and experimentation to make sure that the replica is actually, the model is behaving like the real object. But once you've got that, and once you can sort of protect it securely, then you can do all kinds of experiments. You can do all kinds of analysis. You can predict whether the device is going to fail, and you can also start devising schemes to do self analysis and self diagnosis, right? Because you can test all of this out in the model before you release it into the public environment.
To give a very good example of this.
Yes.
It's almost 15 years back, 20 years back. The light combat aircraft was being designed, and we had an engineering simulator where we built up the control laws, etc. And so what happens that the pilots were trained to fly on the engineering simulator and suggest improvements to the controls. I mean, there is no aircraft existing.
Right.
Then the same was put on the aircraft. So the very first flight, because a single engine, I mean, this is the first time he's flying it.
Yes.
The pilot came back and landed and said, it flew exactly like the simulator. So that was a great achievement for the simulator people.
Yes, yes. And since then, flight simulators have really matured very significantly. That's a very good example. Thank you. And then self-healing systems are also starting to come about now, where once you've got sensors involved, and once you can predict using real-time data that a failure is about to happen, you can do, of course, you can do proactive maintenance, which, by the way, is one of the biggest IoT applications, is maintenance. But you can also start, depending on the kind of system it is, you can, once the system knows it's going to fail, it can start taking certain precautionary measures, either to avoid the failure or to heal itself. And on this particular, it's a very busy chart. It's from the Argonne National Lab, which is a DOE, Department of Energy science lab. You've all heard about Australia, sort of forest fires, and headlines today were Australia is burning. This is a small step in the direction of trying to at least get real visibility into what's going on. So they're using live scanning, they're using sensor networks, remote sensing, geotag data, survey data. They're gathering a lot of information, they're processing it, analytics, and then they are presenting that information visually in a visually understandable way. There's also a lot of work going on, which is not represented here, that tries to predict where the fire is going to go in the future, how it's going to, this fire, some of these fires actually they jump, they jump from one plant or to another, one bush to another, trying to predict how they will jump, how the fire is going to evolve, so that you can start taking some measures. So, but this is a good example of at least how you can get a lot of awareness, situational awareness of what's going on, and hopefully tie that then into emergency response and ways of diminishing the fire. So it says here that they're doing live HPC modeling and prediction based on this data. Now, just going back a little bit to the first chart that I showed you yesterday about the information deluge, much of the deluge is actually coming from these sensors. And much of the sensor data, all of the sensor data is actually potentially extremely noisy. It's totally unstructured, and processing that kind of information in real time is not a very easy job. Nevertheless, technology is progressing and analytics is progressing very rapidly, which helps us then analyze that data. All right, so now hopefully that gives you just a sense of what IoT is, what some of its applications are, and how it can be used to improve well-being. Now, now we'll go a little bit into technology, not too much, just a little bit, to tell you what the driving forces are behind this. So I actually put this thing together about almost 2 years ago. I said, let me see how much computing has improved since I was born. So that's easy to understand, right? I can show you exponential graphs, but that won't make a lot of sense. So storage, hard drives have improved, have become 100 million times cheaper. I should tell you what my age is, but you can guess, I think. Memories for computing have become 10 trillion times cheaper. Cost of computing has gone 1 trillion times cheaper in this span of 60 odd years. These are very, very significant numbers. And I think, again, this is coming from a technologist's perspective. I think a lot of the advances we talked about yesterday in machine learning, in analytics, a lot of that has to do with this fact, that exponential reductions in cost performance of computing storage and memories. Of course, algorithms and computer science plays a major role as well in the delivery of sort of cost-effective solutions, but this is the basic stuff that's going on. And so that the point of that picture is really that we've said that before, but the point is that computing is just everywhere. In our world today, maybe less so in India, but very, very rapidly computing is going everywhere. And that's illustrated by this example. So how many connected devices are there per person? In 2003, it was 0.08. Somewhere around here, between 2003 and 2010, there were more connected devices than people. How many people are there? There are about 6.8 billion people, right? So when in 2010, there were 6.8 billion people and 12.5 billion devices. In 2015, 7.2 billion and 25 billion. And it is expected that by 2020, there will be 50 billion devices. The numbers for India are more in the hundreds of millions, but even that is growing very rapidly. So all of this just to tell you that embedded computing, which we've talked about a lot, is becoming real. And not only is there embedded computing everywhere, it's all connected by the internet. That's what the disruptive change is. So what are the driving forces? What do you do in these IoT applications? You basically collect information, sensors collect information, they communicate amongst themselves and with clouds and so on. Analysis happens, and then some action is taken, right? This is the cycle. And it's driven by 4 technologies, one of which we've already talked about yesterday, which is analytics and machine learning. The others are sensor technologies. You all heard of 5G, I'm sure. It's coming and it's around the corner. And then and the 4th one is distributed computing, which is called cloud edge computing. Now, all these technologies are advancing very rapidly and simultaneously, and these are all being deployed today at various levels, right? So predicting maturity curves might be, S-curves might be difficult at this point, but there's ample evidence, as seen on the last chart even, that this is all happening, and it's happening very, very rapidly. So I'm not going to go through the details here, but smart sensors, at the end of the 18th century, we used to talk about mechanical transducers. This is not typically a sensor that's why it's in quotes, because the definition of a sensor says it has to have something to do with electricity. These are purely mechanical transducers. It's actually measuring something non-electrically. Then there are electrical sensors. So these are real sensors according to the definition. Electrical sensors in the beginning of the 20th century, electronic sensors in the 1970s to the 20th century, and then smart sensors that we are talking about today. This is called, in the usual parlance, sensor 1.0, sensor 2.0, sensor 3.0, and sensor 4.0. This is the sort of category of sensor we are talking about today. These sensors, a lot of intelligence or computing in them. They have very powerful communication capabilities, which will be exploited by, which will use the networks to actually communicate. You should notice the time frames here, right? Seem to be rapidly diminishing, right? If you can see that sensor 4.0 came much quicker after sensor 3.0 than sensor 2.0 came after sensor 1.0. 5G also can be broken down into 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G, right? This is analog voice calls, digital voice calls, and text messaging. That was in the 1990s. Mobile broadband in the 2000s, fast mobile broadband 2010s. That was 4G, which all of you are using today, and around the corner is 5G. Now, it's interesting to look at the 5G use cases. So initially, what's going to happen is just speeds of your smartphones and so on will become better, right? Fixed wireless access, that is already starting to happen. Then there'll be enhanced mobile broadband between 2019 and 2021, just have more capabilities. This is what's important to us from an IoT perspective, that massive machine to machine, the sensor to sensor communication, that will be supported between 2021 and 2022. And finally, for these very, very time critical and very very low latency industrial applications or healthcare applications or security applications, ultra low latency will happen between 2024 and 2025. So many of the scenarios that we are talking about, right, just to put this in some perspective, will actually have the technical capability and the communication capability to be able to support the kinds of applications we've been talking about in their full, very fully. And of course, a lot then will depend on, this is just the underlying technology, a lot then will depend on the kinds of analytics you're able to build on that, the kinds of other things, applications you're able to run. Now, the third thing is called edge computing, which is a new word for distributed computing, as you will easily recognize. How many of you know what a cloud is? Not the one that produces rain. Okay, most of you. So cloud computing is really the notion that the actual computing resources are out there somewhere in the cloud, and services that you would normally get from your computer center are actually delivered, whether they're storage, whether they're compute, whether they're communication services, would actually be delivered to you via this set of resources that is quite remote that you are connected to. So it's really, in my opinion, a service delivery, a different service delivery model. And here, again, going back to my own experience, much of my experience is in this area, right? How do you define and build the massively parallel supercomputers, data management computers? How do you do that in a cost-effective manner? Now, then at the other end, you've got sensors that are basically doing data processing and compression, and you've got mobile devices. So the main human interface into this world is going to be your mobile device. And this whole thing, these are all embedded in various physical objects. This is really what's called the Internet of Things, because these things are all connected via the internet to these back-end data centers. Now, somewhere over here, there is also, there are edge computers, right? And these computers do real-time data processing, data caching, computation, offloading, and this is a massive distributed system where there are billions of these, there are millions of these edge computers, and there are thousands of these, or maybe more of these cloud data centers. As you go in this direction, things become more interactive and more responsive. As you go in that direction, there's more capacity. Now, just to go back to the deep learning, just as an aside, the deep learning training actually happens on these kinds of computers, on very high performance computers. And the inferencing is actually happening down here at the edge. You can just file that away somewhere. Now, when I look at this picture, when I see these devices embedded everywhere in physical, not only physical, but also not embedded necessarily, but at least these trackers are monitoring non-physical, they're monitoring biological processes. It is, I step back and look at this, and I say the following, which you may or may not agree with, that the world as we know it is becoming programmable. Right? So the way this whole thing operates, where there's this convergence of the digital, the physical, and the biological, produces this Internet of Things, but this Internet of Things is actually representing the world today, and it is a programmable world. It's a little worrisome, but that's what it is. It has some good properties, because if you program it properly, you'll improve well-being. It has some bad properties that if you don't do that, then you can cause chaos, which Nitin would probably like. All right, so we've talked about what's the Internet of Things. We've talked about technology that's driving that. And once again, the reason for this is not so much that this is going to influence your own research, but it may, because a lot of social sciences research, a lot of environmental research is actually happening through IoT-like, using IoT-like mechanisms. It's just good for you to know that this is what's happening in the world around you. So now I want, okay, so I'm going to pause here before I go into the next session. I've been talking almost for quite some time now. So any questions? Professor Patnaik.
We also talk about these edge analytics, right? We're talking about now rather than these other traditional analytics.
Yes.
Analytics also coming at the level of edge.
Yes.
Edge or fog, whatever it is.
Yes, yes.
Okay? So what is your take on that? The problems will be of the similar nature, what we find?
Yes, so one of the things, for example, that I think they'll be completely different. So, for example, if you agree that inferencing is actually going to happen here, whereas training is going to happen here, clearly what you do in inferencing is very, very different from what you do in training. And the kinds of algorithms you are going to run for training are going to be very different from what you do for inferencing. So that's just one example. But then, just by nature of the fact that this has to be much more interactive and much more responsive, in fact, if that is really the case, if you're really using this properly, what you're doing is you're doing a lot of the computing here that you can, and you're taking load off this network, and you're reducing the load on the back-end systems. So by almost by definition, this has to do a lot more real-time analytics, which is a very hard problem, as I pointed out. Doing sensor analytics, you've got to figure out do things like what's the signal-to-noise ratio, the thing that I'm sending, is it error-free, is it not error-free? And in some cases, you actually have to make decisions. If something is about to fail in this automobile, you've got to make a real-time decision and take some corrective action. So I think that what you do here, it's a very good question, Professor Patnaik, but what you do here is going to be substantially different from what you do here.
Advances in hardware, especially the AI-based one, where you can do inferencing quickly.
Yes.
Is going to change the picture completely.
Yes.
Except for obviously for training.
Yes.
In fact, the same hardware which is used in interference.
Yes.
With some enhancements can be used for training also.
Yes.
So it is becoming the edge and edge is becoming confused, sort of. And the real usage comes when you are able to take decisions on the go in real time.
Yes.
And that is where all other things that you want to talk about, ethics and other issues will come.
Yes. Yes. Deepa, you had a question.
So actually, I want to share one of my concern that, like, as far as India is concerned, when you talk about agriculture and IoT, that we know that in India, there are large number of population, there are large number of people still depending upon agriculture. They are very pure backward and
yes.
Pure backward, and like their main characteristics are like they are mainly uneducated. They have small land holdings.
Yes.
But then when we talk about the IoT and agriculture, won't it again create a kind of digital divide, and like mainly in the kind of access when we talk about?
Yes, Deepa, that's a very good question. And one of the ethical issues that arises out of all of this, and even about AI and machine learning, is the digital, is that this divide, the digital divide or the economic divide is going to become potentially worse and worse. And so people do worry about, well, the people who are richer, the richer farmers, for example, will be able to utilize this technology. The less well-off farmers with very small land holdings won't be able to. Now, I think they won't be able to, we need to question that. Because with the appropriate government policies and with the appropriate support of the government and the state, there is really no reason why aspects of IoT technologies cannot be used across the board. But people will have to be helped in terms of being able to adopt those technologies. So it's a very good question and a very good example, but so I think we've got to address the full spectrum with these technologies, but at the same time, we shouldn't use that as an argument. We should try to solve that problem, not use that as an argument against deployment of IoT technology wherever it can be deployed. So the adoption rate in the more underprivileged farmers might require a lot more government support, but that's going to be needed, I think. Yes.
IoT also has some serious security issues.
Yes.
For example, they are mostly driven by wireless technology,
Yes.
where security can be compromised.
Yes.
If it is used in a driverless car or in a pacemaker,
Yes.
hackers can hack it and
Yes, yes.
create havoc and problems.
I'm going to, my last two slides are actually on that.
In fact, that's where when I teach my IoT course to students, in a lighter sense, I say IoT means Internet of Trouble.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yes, Nitin.
I just wanted to respond to Deepa actually. So, you know that in India, right, there are like 3.5 lakh coffee farmers, and 98% of them, they don't make any money because the middlemen eat it up. So there is this technology called blockchain technology, which has been released now, and India is the third country to do it after France and Ethiopia. So blockchain allows for the farmer to directly interact with the customer, and that removes the middleman. So that's just an example, that how how technology can actually do a radical change in this kind of stuff,
Yes.
But on the other hand, to support her, for example, in that view, if you take sensors, even if not in a wider area, network sensors, the system wants to know the productivity of a particular piece of land
Yes.
or area, and bankers who get access to all this information are going to definitely deny any kind of assistance to those farmers. So the farmers could be even doomed. Even they can't even start getting assistance.
Yes.
Unless otherwise there is a drastic policy change,
Yes.
which is very difficult in a poor country,
Right.
because you need to have those. So it is a double-edged sword,
Yes.
definitely.
Yes.
Uh,
So
we
what
need to-
the two issues that are being brought up here are, they are very, very clearly issues of integrity of the system and privacy, right? So these are the two, what do you do with this information? And we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but we may as well talk about it now since it's come up. In fact, this cyber physical security problem, that's what we call these systems, because it's physical systems embedded with cyber technology. These cyber physical systems, the security of them is far more complicated than cyber security, because part of what you're trying to do is you're trying to protect the human being, right? Like I said, it's got to be towards the well-being of humans. And then the second issue is there's a lot of information being gathered. How do you guarantee the security of that information? That's a privacy issue. So can you actually sort of hack into a driver-assisted or a driverless car and cause an accident? There are actually examples of throughout the world of integrity issues of that type, right? Even one where somebody hacked into an automatic insulin device and gave the wrong dosage of insulin. So those I call integrity problems, and then there are privacy problems. To me, these two are a little different because privacy is going to require things like GDPR, which India is not doing. India does not have very strict privacy laws. The integrity ones are a very hard issue. But what I have found, I was actually I was actually consulting with a driverless car company, and this whole security thing came up. So yes, if you do think about it in a general sense, it's a very, very hard problem. But if you think about it in the context, and if it's built into your thinking right from the beginning, you can actually design the cyber part of this to be as secure, at least, as any other, by controlling the access point, by controlling the threat points, and so on. But it's a hard problem, and you have to make sure that you don't harm human beings in the middle.
A recent study came out saying that 30 minutes of Netflix streaming.
Can you hold it closer to your?
Oh, okay. A recent study of, I don't know where it came from, but it said that 30 minutes of Netflix streaming releases enough CO2 as much as Spain, right? So as IoT is developed, more devices are connected and there are more data centers developed. So data centers usually need cooling, which in return exhales CO2. So how do you suggest that we control this environmental aspect of it?
Okay, good question. I think there's a fair amount of work that is going on in terms of making supercomputers and other computers sort of much more energy efficient. In fact, I spent a big part of my career actually working on energy efficiency. But I think it's hard for me to comment on that particular study because in my experience, you really have to look very, very closely at the source of the study, the context that the study was done in, and what other people are saying about the same problem, right? So it's hard for me to comment on this particular study, either positively or negatively. I would need to do what I'm asking all of you to do, which is to think about things, use critical thinking in all of these, in these problems, right? And then you have to look at things not in an isolated context, but I can imagine that there are all kinds of effects of streaming videos. You have to look at the broader sort of context in which the study is being done. So I hope you don't mind an answer like that, but without sort of looking at the study personally, it's hard to say whether it's true or not. All I can tell you is that from a technology perspective, companies are very, very focused on carbon reduction, footprint reduction, and building energy efficiency, energy efficient computers, and in fact also very energy efficient devices at the edge.
I don't have a technical question because I'm not an expert, but I just have an ethical dilemma in my mind.
Yes.
When we refer to the cloud, as we all see in iPhones and in MI, Xiaomi phones, the pictures, the videos, your data is synced in the cloud. like with the date, with the place, with like the details of the picture or the video it's
Yes.
shot or taken on. So when it comes to privacy, these things are synced in, and majority of the population, if you see, are above 40 who have just using smartphones with Geo coming in, and they don't know really, like, okay, they're getting synced in, or some of them don't even know the process of how these things are going on.
Yes.
So do you think that these data, like the data which is synced in, can be used by these bigger companies without us knowing, or will, I'm not able to fathom the idea, will this someday backfire, that okay, some data has been stored without your knowledge and that data has been used for a study?
It's
that you're
all,
not
it's
even aware
all,
of?
Niharika, it's backfiring right now as we speak. So this is a huge issue in my mind. My own personal viewpoint is that you should own your data. And in fact, that's the position that Europe has taken with its GDPR legislation, which has got a lot of people quite worried. But ultimately, we have to realize that these companies, the business model of these companies, not all cloud companies, but the business model of many cloud companies is based on gathering your personal information and then making money by selling that personal information to advertisers and other people who are trying to do research, as was done in the presidential election of 2016. And I have all kinds of examples of where bad things have either happened or were about to happen and were stopped. So this is, in my mind, one of the biggest ethical questions that we face, and this one that I had addressed last year as well. So, and throughout this, there are ethical questions, but in many ways, privacy is one of the biggest ones, in my opinion.
So yeah, I was wondering, between self-sufficiency,
yes,
and in a system like this, which is very interconnected,
yes,
does it make it more susceptible to system defects and defaults, as in a problem in one would affect the other?
Yes.
So does it make the system largely sustainable and say more strong, or does it make it more vulnerable, or is it a very case based?
Yes, so it's a very good question. Actually, a long time ago, at least 8 or 9 years ago, we found out that based on what was happening in some of the big cloud providers, that the interconnectivity was actually making the systems more vulnerable. So you could think of this as viruses being easily able to jump from one to the other. Now, that's one side of the coin. On the other hand, systems that are so highly interconnected are also potentially very redundant. And so if you can actually detect problems, perhaps using machine learning, if you can see that something bad is about to happen, whether it's a security kind of threat, or if it's a malfunction in the system, or whether it's an operator error, if you can sort of predict that something bad is going to happen, and you can quickly sort of move whatever you need to move to some other part of the interconnected system, then from a global system perspective, you can have a more secure system. But you may lose sort of whatever functionality you were trying to achieve locally. So let me just generalize that whenever you have these kinds of interconnected systems, they are potentially more vulnerable to failures. But part of what you have to, what people like me, or people who are currently doing what I used to do, part of their mission is to make sure that these systems that are mission critical even as they are interconnected, they are actually very highly resilient. So resilience is a key parameter, and more often than not, we are coming to the conclusion now that to get that resilience, you really have to use machine learning kinds of technologies. Any more? Yes.
My question might be slightly out of the way.
No, but any question is good.
Yeah. You spoke of how technology has improved our well-being. So, what is your concept of well-being?
What is my question of well-being? Okay.
And conversely, was there less of well-being when technology was not there?
Okay, that's a hard one. So well-being is something that has been studied a lot, right? Recently, by the United Nations, by all kinds of other national organizations. There are even quotients of happiness being defined. I was using well-being perhaps in the United Nations sense, which is the sustainability initiatives that the United Nations has, which is well-being means improving. People should have food, people should have water, people should have medical care, people should not be, human rights should be protected. So all of those standard kinds of things, people should be able to get some decent education, at least at a minimal level. That is improved well-being in my mind. By the way, on this question, I would like other people's opinion as well. Was there improved well-being? Was well-being, I think your question is, was well-being better? Was there less of well-being before? I think that's again, I'd like people's opinion on this, but what well-being was in, let's say, Vedic times, and which was a totally different environment and a totally different structure. You can't, in some sense, you can't compare that well-being to 21st century well-being. So the only way I can sort of think through this in my mind is a little incrementally. So it's not too distant past, but right now there's a certain level of well-being. I'm going to introduce, or the world is going to introduce, a certain technology. I think the exercise we have to go through is, do we, as we are introducing that new technology, we need to go through an exercise that says, whatever our definition of well-being is, and hopefully we can agree on United Nations kind of definition of well-being, that this technology improves that, doesn't take you backwards. So in my mind, it would be an incremental exercise as opposed to a historical exercise.
Actually, I think when we talk about that well-being, that we know that if you take WHO definition of health, they I think they added health, mental and physical well-being. That is, they added in 2016 deliberately, because all of the other things they are considering that like it is something defined what is health, but now they have come up with the concept of well-being. So I think it is more than something we talk about, like that mental, that stability or something is we should add in that. So more than the physical. So
yeah,
the mental. That is that answer, but it is actually they are talking about the concept of sustainability also. Sustainability actually
yes.
talking about the well-being of the people, health and well-being.
So on the question of well-being, I think from the earlier time, like from Aristotle's time, he talked about eudaimonia, and that was a kind of having a system of being more intelligent or more rational than being stupid. And even in the Indian philosophical traditions, we have seen Buddha says that the best way of becoming happy or having a good life is to overcome ego. And in the other, like Gita somewhere says that it's about getting into a less embodied state, coming out of the limitations of the body and trying to attain some kind of pure consciousness.
Okay.
I think in the present age of transhuman technologies, I think trying to attain that kind of a consciousness which is devoid of the genetical human stupidity is possible. For example, the tendency of a dinosaur brain. Our brain is hardwired to respond to threats, all threats in the same manner. So even with a little stress, we feel like we are about to die because we are like in that way. So that is something I think Indian tradition says that kind of a dosa, and we can say it's a genetical problem, and that is something intelligent machines can help us overcome. So are we willing to try out, rather than being conservative about just being in this level of species of humanity, are we willing to try out maybe a newer species of intelligent beings, or at least have an experiment of, at least in a virtual world, of simulating a newer environment in which there may be a real utopia, and of course there will be costs associated of energy, etc. But the present situation of having food, healthcare, etc., that takes a huge more amount of energy than trying to simulate a virtual world. I would like to ask, how would you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think absolutely that kind of work must proceed. And I think there are people who say that ultimately human beings, and even our scriptures say this, is that we are a speck in a huge cosmos, right? A very, very tiny speck, and so does modern science say that. And there are people who say that the only way for humans to evolve is to go towards things like superintelligence and cyborgs and a totally different form of life. I don't, personally, I don't object to that, right? I think that may or may not be true, I don't know. And certainly research of the type you are talking about should be done. But it should be done in addition to trying to solve the real world problems of today and not take away anything from that. So I think absolutely these are concepts that should be studied. They should be studied in a positive way, not in a way that this new form of intelligent life is going to destroy us. Rather, this might be the way for us to evolve. This might be the way for us to travel to the other galaxies and planets in the system, and it might be, so we should do all that work, but not at the expense of the current real problems.
So it wasn't a question, it is me just thinking out loud.
Yes.
So when that is with continuation with Shankar sir's question about well-being, the definition of well-being has been changed, as you said, from the time, as per the time and the requirement. Now, the next question that he asked was, when technology was in there, was well-being the same, or I mean, was well-being better, or after technology coming, was well-being being different, or has it rise? Now, to answer that question, I'm just thinking out loud, sir. Probably you can correct me if I'm wrong. Is it also possible that after technology has come, the awareness, the point of awareness is increased, and when we know that the person is showing certain types of characteristics or certain types of personality type, the person is being diagnosed with particular disorder. Has that increased? Is that why the well-being, probably the rate of being diagnosed with a particular disorder is increasing and well-being is decreased? Could that be possible?
Because they are more frequently diagnosed.
They are more frequently diagnosed because the technology is improved, and we know that if they show that these symptoms, they could probably have this disorder.
There is also a misuse then.
Yeah, there could be a misuse in it, but then they're also becoming more sensitive. Letting go of a patient without being diagnosed is much more harmful than being diagnosed with something at least, like trying to be preliminary care at least is good. I'm just thinking about the law, as I said.
I just have 2 points. I don't know if I'm right or wrong there, but like it is not. It is really well known that with technology there are some diseases which has just occurred. Like for example, obesity is a thing which has come now with technology more than it was say 20 years back. Physical exercises were more prominent there, and now with the help of technology you have everything on the tap. Like you just tap and you get those things. Like even for food, you see the culture is developing that way. So don't you think it also has a negative side effect, like a drawback to like well-being? And the second thing is like, yeah, I support the idea that it is getting diagnosed and people are getting right treatment, but people are also misusing that. Like now out of 10 people, you can easily hear 9 people saying that oh, they are bipolar disease is there, or they are depressed, or they have anxiety, without even knowing what these terms actually stand for. And these are medical conditions that people actually get diagnosed with. So there is also a side effect of people misusing it. I don't.
Yeah. So let me comment on some of those comments, right? So first of all, I think you all understood what I meant by incrementally, right? It's improving the current state continuously. What I would say is that we technologists have to pursue a human-centric approach to technology development, which is not really there today. And we have to, I think, look at the implications, the physical, ethical, social implications of the technology before it is deployed, not just the functional capabilities. I think that as technology is going through this exponential adoption rate, it is even critical it is even more critical for us to do that. My second point is I absolutely agree with the perspective that technology can be misused. I am less clear about the relationship between technology and obesity, for example. So I'm less, you've got the, I'm sure you've got articles behind. I'm just giving you my personal opinion, because a lot about personal, a lot of issues really have to, a lot of the way life unfolds is you make a set of decisions, right? Nobody is forcing you at the point of a gun to use a certain technology. So if you are thoughtful about things, then hopefully you won't, and if you're worried about your health, hopefully you won't become obese just because the availability of technology is there. So I'm kind of saying that misuse is always a big issue. Side effects, I think we need to be a little bit more careful in understanding. And the third point is that computers have to become more human-centric.
You take a country like Sweden, where the internet is available much more bandwidth. Everywhere you go, it's there. It is a much more technologically advanced country. And you are talking about the health of the people, both mental health and physical health. They are way ahead of us in terms of utilizing those technologies very judiciously. They have the latest technology everywhere. But when it comes to physical fitness and other habits that they follow, is much more cultivated. It's highly educated, and see, that's a higher level of thinking needs to go with the facility. It is like feeding pigs the best cuisine in the world. That's what's happening to India. I'm sorry, but you need to grow in order to utilize the technology.
It's much more easier to adapt, and then a country like India, which has over 1.3 billion, the adaptability is much more harder. So when you see at the, let's say, the history of India, we didn't move the way West moved with adaptability of technology. Where the West moved is they started with computer, moved on to laptops, and then moved on to mobile phones. But here we made a jump from computers to mobile phones. So with the population as increases, the adaptability is also harder at the level of execution. So when Sweden, with a country such with small population, it's much more easier for them to bring in changes in the society. But in India, how would you suggest that we do that? With 1.3 billion population, the level of reaching to everyone would be harder. So
let me take a crack at that. So in fact, some of the problems that we are talking about, like obesity in the West in particular, perhaps can be attributed to technology the way Niharika was saying. And there might be some goodness in the fact that India was slower to adopt some of those technologies, and therefore is also slower to adopt some of the be impacted by some of the bad effects, right? That said, you're right. In a 1.3 billion population, you can't apply the same policies as you would in Sweden or, let's say, in Singapore, which is actually aggressively going towards a smarter cities solution. But you still have to do your best to raise awareness of technologies and what their impact is and what their potential outcomes are. You have to do that, and you've got to have the right government policies to introduce these technologies in the right way. And how you introduce them in certain communities will be very different from how you introduce them in other communities. You've got to do it in a way that the divide doesn't become worse. You've got to make sure that all boats rise. So it's a complicated problem, no doubt about that. And it ultimately goes back to what was said earlier, that somehow you have to raise the level of thinking. It's much harder to do in India, but you can't say that just because it's hard to do, we are not going to do it. You have to, this goes back to our scriptures, right? The level of thinking in the ultimate sense is what determines everything. Okay, any more questions? This is a very good discussion, by the way. So now let's talk about ambient intelligence. There are a couple of, now you'll be able to, given that you understand what the Internet of Things is, given that you understand what AI is, what machine learning is, and what its capabilities are, we can now start talking about ambient intelligence, which in many ways could be the ultimate IoT application or scenario, right? Because there's a human being, right? There are human beings. The human beings perform actions and sense things from their environment, right? The environment is the home, office, factory, hospital, whatever. And certain external events are happening in this environment. Now, suppose we could do a lot of automatic sensing of the type that we have been talking about, and we are going to use it for improving well-being, not destroying well-being. And this feeds into a system of intelligent devices that is embedded in this environment. These intelligent devices then can actually also operate on this environment and make it more suitable locally for this individual. And the interaction between this is not only intelligent, it in the extreme. So we've talked about intelligent interaction, right? In the extreme, it is invisible. So a simple example of this might be that a park, this is already happening, a park, a garden senses that people are there, senses that the light is not enough, and automatically turns off on the lights. A very, very trivial example. But there are two things. One thing I want to point out in particular, that this whole sort of vision needs to start from a human perspective, right? You start with the human perspective. You then move to other layers. You then move to, well, what will make life easier for this human being? And then you move towards, well, do I have the right kind of technology to provide that set of services? Is the technology feasible? Then you move to, well, what are the kinds of services I can provide? And then, this goes back to my my comment about programmable world. Then you start talking about how do I change the programming of this world so that this interaction happens more naturally and seamlessly, and perhaps even invisibly. But in the course of this analysis and development, there are some significant intelligence issues that need to be addressed, right? Some of these we have talked about yesterday. You've got to be able to recognize and recognize emotions. You've got to be able to move more and more in the direction of general intelligence. You've got to be able to really sense what is happening in the environment. So there's a host of artificial intelligence functionality that one needs to start thinking about and developing. This technical part that I've been talking about, this is in some sense the easy part, right? The programming of the intelligence part, understanding what functionality you actually need, testing it out and deploying it, that's where a lot of the challenges are. So now we can actually make sense of this picture that I showed you earlier, and even taking the grandma support that the robot we talked about yesterday was providing to a different level. So let's start here. This is not necessarily ambient, but this is sort of total interconnection of a whole bunch of sensors and smart gadgets If you're living in a home, even a smart home, there's a smart infrastructure, there's an emergency response system, there's a nurse who is able to, you see these things are being communicated. The functionality, the state of this human being is being communicated to the smart infrastructure, to emergency response, to the nurse, to the hospital, everywhere. So this interconnected system can actually provide you, if you program it appropriately, can provide a set of services to this human being that can't be provided any other way. Now, we are not getting into the debate, we could, about whether providing those services is good or bad, but you can provide those services. In the grandma case, you probably go more and more towards it's a more restricted environment. You go more and more towards potentially being able to do things in a more ambient way. Right? This interaction with relatives and friends we already talked about yesterday. That robot Ellie Q, I think, does a pretty decent job, probably needs to evolve a little more. By the way, in terms of is it real, I went and checked today, so they are taking pre-orders. So the technology is certainly not deployed, but is about to be deployed. You can do things, other things, not to belabor the point too much, you can do other things about monitoring whether the person is taking its medication. Not just giving reminders, but monitoring through sensors and the like, whether the patient is taking medication, and if not, potentially even having that medication, not just have a reminder, but have the medication be delivered automatically, which might be a little scary, may not be the right thing to do in all situations. We've already got many examples of patients wearing these devices, at least in the US, where if you fall down, the device can detect that you've fallen down and will immediately call emergency medical services. This is a huge marketplace in the US at least. So there's all kinds of things that one can start thinking about. The point, though, is that they all need to be, and it's no mistake that grandma is in the center of this picture, is that all of this needs to start with the human being and what the human being's needs for well-being are. Okay, so that's the end of sort of the technique, not totally the end. We're going to just say a few words about cyber physical systems, but we've already talked about this. What is really important to stress is what has already been said, that none of what we've talked about today is going to happen if we don't address the security and the integrity and privacy issues that are sort of prevalent in this class of systems. So the way cyber physical security is defined is any physical or biological system with an embedded computational core, which you can go and attack, in which a cyber attack could adversely affect physical space, impact well-being, lives, or the environment. So you can see immediately from this that this is a much bigger challenge than just straightforward cyber security. Now this includes a whole bunch of other things, even other control systems, but it definitely includes everything that we've been talking about, right? All of the things that we've been talking about are subject to cyber-physical attacks. Now, you won't be able to read this, so this is very, very real. I'll just read out a few of the examples. Airplanes, wrong altitude information causing a plane to crash at landing. Somebody hacked into it. Drone, flight path altered, potentially hurting people. This insulin pump, unauthorized alteration of dosage causing hypoglycemia and potentially death. These are all integrity breach examples. Now, together with that integrity breach, together with those integrity breaches, there are also privacy, confidentiality breaches. In this particular case, this breach may be less critical than this breach, which potentially can cause death, but there was public exposure of the patient's glucose levels. I want to make one point over here, which I think will be interesting to discuss. In my observation, very, very limited anecdotal evidence suggests that in the US, we are a lot more concerned about privacy than we are in India. So I'd like to just talk about that a little bit. Is that true? I mean, the only question on privacy came from Niharika today.
I just think it's a matter of awareness.
Yes.
For technology, it's a matter of awareness. According to me, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but like here, if people are using technology, that's still a new concept. Like, you know, the applications and the mobile phones itself is a very new concept, and the awareness about the function and about how to really you know, get used to the technology is still new. So I think that is the reason why there is it.
Yeah.
Also, I think the perception of threat is probably much lesser, in the sense that, like we were discussing yesterday, what is the worst that could happen with somebody having some amount of data of mine is something that I do not give so much thought to, because I cannot fathom what it could be used for.
Yes.
So, which might not be the case in US probably.
But let me put technology aside, right, for a moment. And maybe things have changed, but in the US, for example, we are sort of very, very concerned about sharing personal information, medical information, any other kind of information. Even for my wife to see my medical information, I have to sign a release form saying that she can do that. Whereas here, is it the same, or is medical information and other personal sensitive information much more easily shared?
It could also
once it gets embedded as law, it is extremely difficult. For example, we are trying to develop a device, ultrasound device, which can be operated by a ultrasound device to scan the fetus, so that a non-expert scans it without seeing the sex of the baby, and hence you know, we can avoid a big danger to the baby.
Right.
But in order to test our algorithms, we needed some real-time scan data.
Yes.
No hospital is willing to give us.
Okay.
Because they are afraid of the law.
Okay.
Once it becomes a law, we are pretty strict, and of course we have methods of overcoming the law under the table. But it is quite strict.
Okay. All
Officially,
right.
we have not been able to get.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Okay, so then these things should be equally.
On this notion of privacy in the West and India doesn't have that. There's some of the political theorists and sociologists say that basically in the West, because this notion of right-centric is there. The people are most right-centric, and that is in the particular history of the West, with the John Locke private property came and this discourse of the human rights and the my rights. While in India, precisely because of this community-oriented culture, which is mostly caste and the community-based. So I have the example that when I stayed in a village for some field work, so there I have got the room. So I thought that this room will be mine only, but I was thinking after some time every person was coming, so they don't have this concept. They were thinking that if some guest has come, we should welcome it, if not to ask about him and not to welcome him and share with, so that would be the offense to that. So that might be in the case of the kind of the different life world we are inhabiting.
Okay, right.
So maybe the socio-economic level is at play, because in India, most humans are still dealing with the very basic issues, and the law system is so draconian, nobody wants to get into it and get into the legal issues.
Yes.
Maybe in the West, they are at such a level of development that like things like intellectual property, copyright issues, these are something very huge things, and the lawyers, they have a huge industry in which they take on into small things and make it a huge issue.
Right.
So that is why there is more awareness there. Probably.
Yes. So lower on the Maslow's hierarchy, right?
A lot of soldiers on the borders of Pakistan and China have been catfished by the spies of other nations. Well, when you said that we are open and we don't care, but when it comes to national security, it has affected us deeply. Because with cheap availability of Chinese phones, Xiaomi, Oppo, or Vivo, the Chinese are able to track. Because as they're cheap and our soldiers are not paid well, they would rather go to a cheaper phone within available, 10,000 rupees or 20,000 rupees, and they were able to track Indian soldiers with high accuracy, and they were able to, take information data on all of it. So when it comes to national security, how are you going to deal with that?
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, I've been just throwing questions all around.
Maybe you should throw yourself.
I think Preet Kona, he asked me to come over here because we've been discussing a couple of ideas on my startup. So my name is Lohit. Okay, so sorry I didn't introduce myself. And then, yeah, when we're going back to the question, what happens when it comes
to... are you doing a startup? We wish to know who people are, because we are kind of very phenomenological here.
Okay, so why I came here is I've been discussing about a startup idea with my friend Preet Kona. So the idea is that as artificial intelligence, I was supposed to come yesterday, but I got a notice later around 10:40, so I couldn't make it. As artificial intelligence is moving towards tackling more of physical needs like transportation or delivering the food or taking care of medical, the human aspect where when you said we need to bring the human aspect in, which are the emotions of what makes us a human. So I've been trying to bring that into artificial intelligence by probably, I don't know if it will work, but I thought of doing it how as humans became a socially community by mirroring neurons in our body. We mirror whatever others look at. So you feel sad, I will be empathetic to feel sad with you. So I would bring that into the artificial intelligence where it could mirror anybody's response to feel more human.
Okay.
So that is what I was thinking about, and then I'm just doing a little research.
Okay. So welcome to this 3 series of lectures, and go ahead with your question.
Well, yeah, when it comes to national security, how are you going to deal with it?
Who is that being addressed to?
No, she said that we are open to, no, not her, the one.
Okay.
All I'm saying is that our perception of these or our understanding of these national security issues as an individual is probably much lesser, and we are much lesser aware of these things as maybe somebody in US might be. Their perception of threat is probably higher than ours as a community because we are less aware. That's it.
Are you aware of the recent
So maybe we can take this offline. Okay. Any more questions?
that thinking of privacy in the sense of the lower and the higher income group, but the point was that actually the notion of privacy and of the sharing my thoughts with my community is more kind of the cultural based idea rather than the income and on the basis of the economy, because the thing is that, as I was discussing with Meera with yesterday, that might be the legal language and the technical language might not provide me the proper outlet where I can express my desires, fantasies, and the concern. And the natural language where which community has in the forms of the myth, metaphors, it provides the more leeway to express my desires, fantasies, and the concerns. So that which might not be available in the proper legal kind of the framework, that if I model myself in the particular in the strict privacy, so that might not be suitable for the kind of the cultural unconscious or the cultural self I have.
Yeah. So I just like to add one thought to all of that, and I'm not sure which particular scripture this is from, whether it's from the Artha Shastra. But there are very specifically, our scriptures say that there are 10 things that you are not supposed to share with people. Is anyone aware of that more than me? I only know some of the examples. One example is you don't have to tell people your age. You don't have to tell, this is in the scriptures. You don't have to tell people your income. This is all personal information. You don't have to tell people your illnesses, and there's a whole list. There's
You practice it perfectly.
Oh yes, you do. Okay. Yeah. So I think there's no real philosophical basis for saying that we need to be more.
Mantra, for example, Guru Mantra, people keep highly private.
Yes. But there are these other very pragmatic things that our scriptures tell us we shouldn't be sharing. I think some of that we've actually lost, and it would be good to get that back. Okay, so we've done enough on this. I just want to end with this one slide that says the cyber physical system security is a make or break thing. If we don't address this problem, all of the things we've been talking about with IoT, they are not going to work. That said, you have to, I think a lot of incremental progress is being made and will continue to be made. So this is my last slide, summarizing what we've talked about today. So I've described to you, even before getting into the technologies, I've given you an overview of what Internet of Things is by example. We've described the driving technologies behind the Internet of Things. And maybe I didn't make this point clearly enough, but combined with machine learning, which was one of the 4 driving technologies, we are seeing a very, very rapid evolution of IoT. And you can see why, right? IoT is really generating all of this data that we don't know how to handle. So we've got to leverage machine learning, and we are leveraging machine learning to actually be able to analyze this data and remove the signal from the noise and derive some information out of all of this data. And then we talked about ambience intelligence, which in many ways I think is the ultimate IoT application. And throughout this I've talked about how this technology development needs to be human-centric. I think more and more people are recognizing this, and the goal has to be to improve well-being. That said, going back to the earlier point that was made, technology can always be misused. And by the way, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on that in my external lecture. And we've got to address cyber physical security problems. So thank you all for listening patiently and for that great dialogue. That's the end of my talk.
The floor is now open for further questions. If anyone has more questions. Sangeeta ma'am would like to say something.
Sure.
Sorry, this is called I'm not coming for the class and asking a question. So I just wanted to know, the idea of well-being, is it something different in the context of artificial intelligence and Internet of Things? Because the whole idea of being a human or a human-like system itself is very different, because as we were discussing yesterday, the whole idea of rationality is kind of emphasized and emotions as something like an add-on. So in that context, when we talk about well-being, is it a kind of a different notion of well-being, or perhaps I was wondering what notion of well-being you had in mind?
Yeah.
In that
So we talked about this question. We talked about. He asked this question.
Oh, really?
And I'll give you my answer, which is it's really my notion of well-being is the same as the United Nations, World Health Organization view of well-being. As was pointed out, that includes physical well-being, mental well-being, that includes security, it includes privacy, it includes basic needs, all of the above. So, and I'd further like to make the point that in all of the work that I've been talking about, I don't, the emphasis is not on developing something that replaces human beings, even though we've talked about how you might evolve to the next step of transhuman devices. The entire focus here is on how computing can be used to help human beings, and the level of intelligence that you can build into computers, so that the combination of man and machine can solve problems that neither can solve by themselves. So that is really the thinking that drives, and it's important to understand that, because I'm not so interested in replacing human beings or creating something that has the same emotions as a human being or the same level of intelligence as a human being. The focus here is on combining, in some sense, the capabilities of machines with the capabilities of humans.
Yeah, thank you so much for that perspective. I wish to add something here, maybe also for a larger discussion, not now, perhaps at a later time. The current definition of well-being, which is accepted, includes various kinds of well-being, like as you said, physical, social, mental, and social. But interestingly, I mean, I'm not kind of endorsing any theory, but if you look at critical theory or social theory, the whole idea of being free is very important to being well. You know, the whole idea of having the ability to make free choices is very, very important to lead to well-being, because freedom and the ability to make choices seems to be connected very much with the dignity of a person.
Yes.
And also is or her on independent assessment of what is required for that person.
Yes.
So I would look forward to that day when the notion of well-being in a kind of a global context would include choice making and being free as very, very important. And if at all we include that, then it becomes even more problematic, because we live in a world where every day you are brainwashed. Without that smart gadget, you're not going to do well. Without this, you're not going to do well. And the every day is kind of a negotiation between the marketing technologies and the super intelligent minds of the creative people who are able to make fantastic ads and make you think that you are lesser being without that product. So there is a negotiation which is happening every day. In this context, to make choices, which makes you free, which sustains your dignity, I would think that is extremely interesting and maybe very, very exciting. But
Yes.
I really don't know how it's going to be possible tomorrow.
So maybe I didn't fully understand your first point, but as far as but the basic human rights, the fundamental human rights, as even described in the United Nations charters, includes this notion of freedom of choice and this notion of having the right to be yourself. So in some sense, and you're much more, Professor Menon, the expert in this than I am, but I think that is built into even the United Nations definition of freedom of choice. On the second point, I think that's a very, very important point, and it came up obliquely because somebody said that a side effect of technology is obesity, because you can get everything at the push of a button is why you become obese. To which one of the responses I had was, well, you are free to make that choice of using that technology or not. And I would say that even in the present world of echo chambers and advertising and social media, you've got to raise the awareness of people so that they continue to be able to exercise free choice. In fact, one of the reasons why I've been going around talking about ethics is, and this isn't a developed versus non-developed nations issue. This is an issue everywhere, that people are just not aware of how they are being manipulated, how their preferences are being worked. And you can't blame that on technology, right? Unless, of course, people have violated security and privacy in the process of producing those ads, then of course you've got to address that in all kinds of ways. But other than that, I think you've got to raise the level of awareness of people.
First, let me clear that I am not against all these things, but I am asking the question in very generic perspective. Don't you think that being a anthropocentric or human-centric, we are becoming more selfish about the others, which we are equally sharing our environments, resources, everything? Because when it comes to the building infrastructure, fulfilling the requirement of this technology, we are bridging the privacy of others beings. Like if you take example of forest, when it comes to the forest, in the plants and trees, for the requirement of infrastructure we need lands. So for building the infrastructure we clear the forest, and then there are so many wild animals or the other. When it comes to the tower, like mobile network towers, so they affect the bees and all. So don't you think that in concern of our privacy we are bridging the privacy of other beings? How others?
I think that's definitely true, right? I think progress, unfortunately, has happened at the level of progress at any cost, right? And now we are starting to see and feel the impact of that in terms of environmental changes and deforestation and so on. So there's a difference, though, I think, between that line of thinking. So absolutely there need to be policies, need to follow United Nations guidelines on sustainability. If you're going to destroy a forest, you need to plant trees, and in fact the sustainability goals of the United Nations need to be implemented by all nations, right? That's a sort of global issue that I'm not addressing here. That needs to be done. I'm saying within the context of where we are today, let's take a human-centric approach to, and by human-centric, I don't mean you-centric or me-centric, I mean people-centric, right? So we are not down, until we get into precision medicine, we are not down into you as an individual. So the human-centric is, the people-centric is really people-centric, not one individual-centric.
But don't you think that the people that we are more caring about our well-being rather than the well-being of all, very inclusive, we are being very exclusive in that sense. We are, when it talks about the well-being of ourselves, or when it's the people's self or the community self.
Yes, as opposed to other plants and
animals
and all of that.
Because they are also like getting so much problems, so many like the problem of extinction and all.
Yeah, it's
luckily it is answered by again the same problem. If the bees are affected, you are affected ultimately. There is a time delay. Unfortunately, there are enough think tanks and people who think like you, who for every action we take, they question. So eventually it's a self-correcting mechanism, because we still want human beings to live. Bees are a support service. We don't want to get rid of them.
More selfish than
That's what you are.
Niharika was just saying that maybe we should have an ecosystem-based thinking, so that it is not bee versus plants, or maybe, as you said, people or the beings of the entire system. Kind of a very of a system perception, right, as a whole.
Coming back to the question of choice, when you're given ultimate or complete freedom of choice, if you're aware of this technology called CRISPR, which is a gene editing technology, where you can order a kit and you can edit your own genes, and then you can make yourself a better human. So would you let that be natural, or what would happen if you give them a complete freedom of choice?
No, I didn't order that kit.
No, but people in, I think he might be knowing that people.
So
in
that's
America,
what, and that's one of the big ethical dilemmas that, again, that's one of the ones that I talked about last year. But I come from a particular perspective that says you can't stop technology progress. And yes, there's going to be regulation about how much you can use CRISPR technologies and genetic engineering. In England, for example, they're a lot more open about this than even in the United States. But ultimately, as regulations are developed, I think use of the technology does become one of choice. You can say that, yes, then now that's going to create a divide. That is fine. I think we've got to address those kinds of issues, but ultimately, from my perspective, you can't just arbitrarily stop technology progress, and you can't take choice away from people. But these are ethical dilemmas. There are no right or wrong answers.
Actually, when we talk about the choice, when we take the examples of traditional knowledge, digital library, it is a kind of documenting all the traditional knowledge, traditional medicinal knowledge. But then it has a purpose to use, whether you can use it for the, apply for the intellectual property, or you can actually use it as a kind of defensive protection. But then again, the ultimate result is that sometimes it is actually classified on the basis of the international patent classification.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, we are trying to actually protect something from the threat. But the result is that maybe again it will directly or indirectly can use by the multinational corporation. But in this context, we can actually we don't have that kind of choice to use the technology. But I think that there should be, as you said, there should be proper law and regulations by again that the same technology we are trying to use it for the protection, causing for the threat. that is should be we can only like actually applicable only through proper law and regulations.
So are you saying that intellectual property protection of, let's say, pharma drugs, are you saying that is taking away the ability to deliver those drugs to certain people, or it's taking away choice from people to use those medications?
What is happening that like there is a drawbacks, like we are trying to ICMR is trying to protect all the traditional medicine.
Yes.
that is documenting traditional knowledge digital libraries initiative by
Yes.
ICMR. But then again it is causing for the another kind of threat is by it can use by the multinational corporation directly or indirectly when it comes to the public, because some kind of information is available in the public.
Yes.
So that can actually can reverse that kind of the result. What we actually trying to protect can make it in the public. So in that context,
I'm not sure. Can somebody translate for me?
That traditional knowledge digital library, that is we are trying to protect all the traditional medicine knowledge. It is by ICMR, India's initiative.
What is the scale of it? Because ICMR,
They are trying to document all kind of traditional medicine knowledge. By Ayush Ministry and ICMR. It is the initiative taken by the ICMR. So when it is based on the international patent classification. So when it comes to the it is actually trying to publicize some kind of information. But then when it comes to the developed countries, it is basically handling by the USPTO. So when it comes to the public, they can directly or indirectly they can actually use it a kind of they can use the. Not patent, it is actually blocking the patent, but some kind of information they can use
so therefore
that is kind of threat again. That
we live in threats all the time, right? We cannot stop people from using information. I mean,
that is why I'm saying that there should be kind of proper law and regulation in that kind of.
First of all, I would think, I mean, if I may, first of all, I would think that what is the kind of documentation which ICMR is doing should be of an open access information, because I am a believer of open access. All information should be available. I don't know what is that kind of documentation which you are talking about. What is that which is being documented? Is it the documentation of their oral history? Or is it just their etiologies? Or is there diagnosis patterns? Or is the documentation of the illnesses history and maybe the magic medicine they have developed? Right, doctor? So unless we have all these classifications, we don't have a full information, because you and I know that we are working in this field, right? That's why we are documenting it. Where is the documentation? I don't see any documentation. I mean, what perhaps, Suganya is also doing it. So when we document, what exactly are we documenting? Because it's very, very important to document the oral history. Because in cultural history such as this, it is very different from the Western medicine where you have a pill for things. You don't have a pill for a disease. In fact, you have a lifestyle for a disease. Mm-hmm. Your disease is changed not by a pill, but by a lifestyle. And that lifestyle can be documented only through their oral histories. Right? I don't know what Suganya might like to respond to something.
Actually, it is important to document oral history, but even in my personal experience, I'm saying, even researchers are misusing so many traditional knowledge by taking their intellectual property right. So there will be no options at all. Anyway, we should document for our next generation. They should know about their traditional knowledge, like that we should use, but there is no options for that. Anyway, whatever we used to document, it can be used by anyone. Because by clicking anything, we are getting so many things from Google. So we shouldn't stop that.
Right. And then some of these things that you're documenting, do they have patentable ideas in them?
No, actually, it's like They are not aware about this. If I used to go for a field, then I'm saying I'm studying regarding the traditional medicine of this community. They are saying whatever things I know, I will tell you. They are orally telling, I scribbling it, then I am publishing.
Yes.
But along with this, I should also mention their names in the publishing. They are the informant. They gave these things to me.
Yes.
Like
so I think it goes back to what Professor Menon was saying, which is if there are actually real intellectual property there by international definitions, then I think that should be somehow protected. But if it is really oral histories or sort of lifestyles or high-level processes that one goes through, that should be readily available to everyone. And if somebody from that is able to derive the right information, then they've actually done some of the hard work, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I just wanted to bring in one more thing. I think we all are users of Sci-Hub, right? Everybody uses. That's okay. I mean, because Sci-Hub itself is very vocal. You see their tagline. Our mission is to remove any barrier which is impeding the widest possible distribution of knowledge in human society. And why Sci-Hub is becoming stronger and stronger? Because there are a huge number of populations, institutional, academic institutions. I think some of the very important academic institutions in the US recently, I mean, I don't want to name any, but who has kind of stopped buying huge subscriptions, because this is all very controlling. So, you know, so there's a huge movement to get into open access and make knowledge pervasive and accessible to everyone, you know, beyond the divide of developing and developed countries. So, you know, I mean, people are kind of becoming more and more signatories to Sci-Hub, and that's just because they're just making it possible for a lot of scholars like you and me to access information, and we may not have the money to subscribe all that like in other countries. So I thought I should just bring in that.
You had a question, yeah? Another transhuman question? Posthuman.
This may be the last question because we're running a bit.
Like a slight critique on the idea that we should only focus on like well-being of humans or the ecology. So my point is that we cannot really solve the problem with the same tools which we had used to create it. So humans have always said that we could do this, create nations, religions, etc., and ultimately all problems will be solved. So, but in the age of Anthropocene, we have realized that we have actually created much more problems of greater varieties. So, from a, say, a post-human perspective, like, if from an ecological perspective, if we see the idea of the keystone species, so those are those species which have an like extremely important role in their ecosystem. So we have tigers, elephants, etc. as keystone species. We also have humans, who are the worst keystone species possible. Yes. So I think from an ecological perspective, it will be more like the ecology would want another species other than humans who would have a better impact upon the environment. And just taking this argument forward, from an anti-natalist perspective, anti-natalists are those who think that life itself has a very negative value, and either it should be removed, or its assumptions should be changed. So today's life is completely driven by consumption and competition. So if somehow we could change the very assumptions or basis of life away from consumption and competition, maybe we could completely change life from the base and remove all the different sets of exploitation that exist. And it is for the first time in the history of world that we are able to do that through these technologies. So I think rather than being very skeptic about using technologies, I think we should take a very leap of faith forward and let technologies maybe do a greater deal than what we are capable of.
Okay.
So this is just a follow-up of what Professor Menon and you also talked about this United Nations of the rights and the freedom. So, I think that United Nations, the notion of the freedom is more from the perspective of the distributive justice. So the distributive justice where everyone should have the access to the public good and systems. While critical theory also underscores the importance of the problem, they say there is also a kind of the existential dimension to this freedom, which actually in the technology society the alienation occurs, because I totally objectify myself in the technological objects which are out there. So self can be found everywhere outside except inside. So which is actually they are underscoring the danger, which might be the distributed justice is not capable of accounting. Yeah.
Okay. Both good comments.
Okay. So now I think we would like to conclude today's session, and we wait for tomorrow's the last lecture in the 3-day in-house lecture. I would request Meera Menon to give the formal vote of thanks.
I think one of the reasons why some of us in yesterday's polls opted for the Internet of Things is probably because, at least as some of us as social science and humanities students, we are not as updated as about future technology as we would like to be. And there is no denying that it is a complete privilege to hear about future technologies from someone as experienced as you, sir. So thank you, Dr. Tilak Agarwala, for giving us this very interesting lecture. And thank you, Dr. Sankita Menon, for conceptualizing this session and making it possible. Thank you, Niharika, Rakesh, Hari, and Abhishek for all the support that they have been offering so far. And Kumar sir, of course, for letting us help go public. And so thank you everyone for making this a very interesting discussion. We from artificial intelligence we moved on to ecology, to health, and all of that. So it was a very enriching discussion. So thanks everybody.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you for participating and for a very interesting set of discussions. Thank you.